Well, hello there and welcome to Cybos TV. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Daisy McAndrew, broadcasting here from the massive Boston Convention Center. Now we're going to be looking at what on earth is going on in the digital payment sector. Are we really seeing Apple entering into this area? Joined, delighted to say, by two experts who are going to guide me through this area. To my immediate left, Mark Curran. Thank you for joining us on Cybos TV, Mark. You're from Lloyd's Banking Group. And to your left, Christophe Uzero. Thank you, Christophe, for joining us. You're from Gartner. Fascinating picture, this, with Apple seemingly dipping its toe in the market. Mark, first of all, tell us what's going on.
So, the Apple announcement was much expected. We've been waiting for Apple to do something in the payment space since the iPhone 4 came out, and I can't remember what that was. It was a lot of years ago, though. They didn't do it for 5, and they've now done it for 6. I think what they've announced, though, is, and you've got to delve into the depths of it, they've recognized that becoming a bank at this stage isn't for them. And Apple Pay itself allows them to use the rails of kind of banking technology, but allow them to put that on their devices. And let's face it, an awful lot of consumers love their devices. It's an interesting announcement, though, because they are now going to be inundated with requests from banks around the world for them to be the chosen bank in that country. And it's quite an astute play for them, because they haven't had to crack the international banking boundaries or become a global payments player. They will simply use whichever bank in that location, I guess, pays them the most to become their chosen provider. And I think kind of couple that with the device capability of Apple, and that's a really strong place to be.
Christophe, you can see why Apple would want to do this, but what are the ramifications as an analyst that you see for the market as a whole?
I think it's one important point. What we need to raise is first, is no guarantee of success for Apple Pay. I just want to mention a couple of the challenges that Apple Pay could face, because that's an implication for what the banks could do. First, there is a peculiar US situation. The role of Apple Pay and why the banks and the card industry was interested is very much related to the need for EMV migration and the challenges with the business case. It's very much related to the fact that NFC, let's put it that way, hasn't really delivered, to be polite. So there is very much a need to change the status quo. So for the card industry to start to work with Apple Pay makes sense. But we have to think beyond those very US-centric and also beyond retail payments. First, for a bank, we need to think about what's the real role of a bank as part of this. Let's assume there is some traction. Let's be more optimistic. Let's put aside the challenges. Let's assume there is some traction. Now we have a situation where user of Apple, every time they make a payment at the point of sale, we start to use the Touch ID. This implies that there's a kind of a de facto recognition that Apple is providing a digital ID. Of course, the construction of a digital ID is not Apple-centric, but that's a perception. So there's a key question for banks for the long term. Do you really want Apple to be perceived as the delivery mechanism of consumer digital ID? I don't know what you think about that, Mark, if it's a fair comment or not, but...
No, I think it is. I think the capability that device brings is game-changing for them and brings them to the forefront of consumer transactions. Whether that has traction, to your point, that extends it beyond consumer transactions, and there are an awful lot more than just you and I paying for kind of our coffee in Starbucks. Other brands are available, but there are an awful lot of more consumer use cases than just that. And I think what they bring is first mover. There are a lot of people out doing this, but that capability, their model will be, their revenue model, they will charge the institutions for, and the retailers to potentially for clicking that device or using the fingerprint technology, and that's where their revenue model comes from. But think about it more widely. So forget Apple for a second. They're not setting out to become a bank, they're setting out to become a digital payments provider. And the reason they're choosing to do that is because becoming a bank in all the countries that Apple provides that service to is pretty. There are only 3 or 4 big global banks in the world, let's face it. So the play from where they are today to that is too big. The second thing is, and let's move away from Apple for a second, think about someone like Vodafone offering a similar wallet as a provider of telco rather than a device. If Vodafone in the UK with 18 million customers, every customer put kind of £100 in a stored wallet of their 18 million consumers, they would have a market capitalization as a bank somewhere bigger than kind of just outside the big five. They wouldn't be protected by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme and all the things that sits behind it. And that's kind of one of the reasons why Apple have chosen to go the way they have, because there's an awful lot of regulation and bank capability that they would have to replicate were to become a bank.
Well, I was going to say, Christophe, do you think that the regulators, the politicians, the policy makers are aware of what's going on in this market? Because it seems it's a lot easier for them to concentrate on the people that they do know and understand, as in the banks, rather than these new entrants to the market.
I think there is clearly a challenge, there is a dichotomy, so to speak, because on one side they want to promote innovation, they want like a challenge to the banks, or at least challenge to the providers of some payment services, but they want some stability, and you can't really have both to some extent. We see this clearly with the current debate with international remittances. It was clear with the UK market, for example, like starting to see, okay, you need to be very careful with KYC, how you provide banking services to other banks, which are intermediary between the different agents and so on. But if you do this, you start to stop providing the service. And then you have an issue of bancarization. So an issue of innovations. So there is this ongoing debate, and the challenge is, for any regulator, is actually not to try to do too much, but to try to nudge certain other players, which is easier said than done. But the worst thing they could do is to say, okay, this is how the market is going to look like, because there are always unintended consequences. Yeah. And one key fundamental point is, for a lot of regulators, they tend to regulate one silo. So I may regulate the bank, another regulate the mobile operator, and so on. And so how do you manage those unintended consequences if you can't manage all the silos and align those? And that's a very key challenge, and one which will be difficult to sort out. But
it's a brilliant point, because you find yourself in any market now being regulated down four kind of different axes. You've got competition, innovation, kind of conduct and market access, and then kind of regulatory safety. In the UK, we've got the FCA and the PRA and kind of the Competition Commission, Uncle Tom Cobley and all. And it's a great point, Christophe, that silo mentality. If everybody wants what they want, the answer ends up being a hodgepodge of Spanish customs. That means somebody's got to lose out. And kind of third-party payment supply in the UK at this point is one of those areas where the competition world and the government are asking banks to be really open, but yet you see huge fines for banks who can't be clear on transactions and where they've initiated from, and being held to rule for that. And when we bankers get to kind of, well, everybody's asking us to do something slightly different, we always fall back on that risk place.
Because as Christophe said, there's that tension that comes from any sort of regulation that you stifle the entrepreneurship, and particularly as we're coming out of a global crisis, and where every politician says that he or she wants to encourage as much, as many entrepreneurs as possible, and yet because we're coming out of a crisis, those same politicians want to tell the public that they're doing everything they can to keep them safe. It's a very difficult juggling act.
I agree.
So if you were a regulator, what would your advice, or if you're an advisor to a regulator, what would your advice be? Why
don't you all have a cup of coffee and agree what the blended model is? And look, it's a tough world being a regulator, particularly in a kind of post-recessionary period that we've had. Everybody's worried about collapse or failure. But I think the difficulty is a lot of people are looking at that through the lens of 8 or 10 institutions globally, 300 or 400 institutions, and Christophe's earlier point, all these new entrants are coming into the market, and I think there is a risk that there's an opportunity, one, for innovation and for there's clear customer demand. Customers want these new services, let's face it. But there's a risk that in a non-regulated way, we could have so many shocks where transactions or balances in flight are lost as a result of a failure or a bankruptcy of one of these providers that the regulation has to cover the gambit.
And coming to specific regulatory reforms, AML, KYC, what impact are they having on money transfers and the price?
Well, money transfers and AML and KYC are you just got to look at the fines that UBS have taken in recent years, and a number of institutions, including Lloyd's, to be open and honest. those put an inherent increased risk. That doesn't always transfer through to price. Certainly domestic transactions, I think we're seeing those, the price point for those are now so low, you can't price that risk in. It effectively becomes an operational cost of the bank. But it is a responsibility. And I think something like, for instance, PSD2, we're kind of weighing up at the moment this idea of third-party providers being legislated into PSD2 against being responsible for that third-party provider actually initiating that transaction on behalf of a legitimate individual. And kind of there's a bit of head-scratching going on around how we'll do that. And I think the cost doesn't come into how much it costs customers, but it does come into the bottom line, because these end up being very large projects, and we all lawyer up and go and work out how to do this stuff.
And Christoph, with so many non-traditional corporations and firms coming into the market, Google and Facebook, and we've already mentioned Apple, what's the possibility that none of them are going to be able to talk to each other?
To a certain extent, we have to expect that, because first, they call alternatives, but they're not really, except PayPal is an exception, let's say this. A lot of them don't have a payment brand. The reason why Apple call it Apple Pay as well, because if you take Apple today, even with iTunes, it's not a payment brand. Yeah. You build a payment brand, of course, on frequency, but also how you deal with fraud, or you manage a fraud case and so on. And today, except banks, not many companies are prepared to actually spend the time and the money to investigate a fraud case. And that's how you build a payment brand. So a lot of those brands, they're not really pure payment brands or pure payment providers, except PayPal, I must stress. So what's happening is, what they're doing is they're contextualizing some of the payment system that already exists. So what is interesting is what this contextualization will carry on and become more and more fragmented because of the different shopping patterns that we are taking on and so on. So from a point of view for your industry, trying to achieve interoperability and standardization from that perspective of those providers, I'm not sure it's worth it. What is interesting is what's happening in the back office. You could argue that actually Visa and MasterCard are already enabling that interoperability. So that's one part. The second part is from the bank perspective. The banks have an opportunity to start to think, well, actually I don't need to control all those different payments components. I could be more open, and I could start to say work with Google Wallet for that part, work with Apple Pay for that market, work with PayPal in that market, and so on and so on. And some banks are already doing this. You see, the key point for banks is to accept that I'm not able today to contextualize all my payment services. I have to accept that there are other companies that are better than me at doing this. So how do I work with them? How do I become what we tend to call sometimes an independent payment advisor, with the role of a bank, focus on money management and handle that, instead of focusing on the standardization and interoperability from those providers, because that's not the market they are in anyway. So I think it's important to stress that.
There's a lot going on. Well, gentlemen, I'm afraid we're out of time, so I'm going to have to draw this conversation to a close, but I'm sure it's a conversation that will happen throughout the week here at Sibos 2014. But thank you so much for joining us on Sibos TV. Mark Curran from Lloyds Banking Group and Christoph Uzero. Join us back on Sibos TV in just a few minutes when we're going to be talking about virtual currencies. See you then. Bye. And welcome back to Sibos TV. Well, after a year of seemingly hysterical headlines about Bitcoin and so on, here at Sibos TV, we are determined to take a cool, calm and collected look at what's going on with virtual currency. So I'm delighted to be joined by Adam Shapiro on my left, Promontory LLC. Thank you, Adam, for joining us this afternoon. Richard Brown, to your left, Adam, from IBM UK. Welcome to the programme, Richard. And finally, Jerry Gates from the Canadian Payments Association. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Adam, can the genie be put back in the bottle of these virtual currencies, or has that bird flown, if I can mix my metaphors horribly?
I think the bird or the genie has flown, whichever it is. And I mean, there are two ways that the genie could be put back in the bottle in theory, one of which is if people don't adopt the technology, and the other of which is if someone, probably a government, shuts it down. And I think both are difficult. I think it's hard for not to see the power in a technology that allows people to send money to each other whilst choosing whether to use a financial institution. And I think if we asked ourselves now the question of could you put email back in the bottle, which is a very similar peer-to-peer system, people would look at me as if I had 3 heads. And I suspect in 20 years people will say that about this technology. The other interesting question, of course, given all the concerns about money laundering and consumer protection, is, well, can it be stopped? And I think, again, the answer is no. One of the reasons that the technology is hard to stop is that it's fundamentally based on open source software. It's based on a decentralized or distributed network of people contributing it. So unlike a traditional financial network, there's not one entity in the middle that if you shut it down, you can stop it. And so I think the question becomes, for banks looking at this, well, what are the implications of this? And for policymakers, well, how do we get to a position where we harness the power of this technology in a good way and not in a bad, fight government, let's try and use this in illicit sort of way?
Absolutely, Richard, that brings me on to my question for you, which is it's tempting to discuss this issue in a purely negative way. Oh, can we stop it? Can we put it back in the bottle? But actually, paint me a picture of what the good stuff about these virtual currencies are. If there is benefits and positives, what are they?
Sure. So I guess the first thing to say is that mainstream adoption of cryptocurrencies is still fairly modest, but we're already gaining some really quite intriguing insights as to how they're being used and what benefits they can bring. So just recently, the Boston Fed, so here in Boston, published a paper where they looked at the experiences of firms who take Bitcoin payments online for their goods, and they looked at the prices, for example, being charged by Overstock. And what they found, which I think surprised many people, was the cost to Bitcoin purchasers of goods on Overstock was actually slightly less than what they'd pay if they paid using regular currency, which I think was a surprise to many for various reasons. And
I was going to say, just to interrupt you, what were the reasons why those savings were made?
So that's the really interesting thing. So one of the explanations they suggested, although they need to do more testing to check this, was that merchants face a lower risk of fraud when they take Bitcoin payments, because Bitcoin payments from consumers are immediate and final and can't be charged back. So whereas merchants run the risk that they will be subject to consumer fraud with credit card chargebacks, they're not subject to that with Bitcoin. And the observations of the Boston Fed are, it seems that some merchants are sharing that saving with consumers. And the point to add to that is, well, okay, that's a fairly minor case within a single country such as the US. But if you now look at international e-commerce, which is really quite modest in adoption because of the greatly increased risk of credit card fraud, it's potential that paying in something like Bitcoin or a similar push payment technology could enable cross-border retail consumer commerce that otherwise wouldn't happen at all. So really quite intriguing findings in that paper.
So fascinating sort of scene setters from our first two comments there, Joe. But from the coalface, if you like, from the bank's perspective, what are the banks thinking about this now, and can they see beyond the negative into the positive?
I think this is really challenging for banks for 3 reasons. One, the regulatory questions are still turning around, and virtual currencies don't fit well within existing regulatory frameworks. So there's a lot of work going on and a lot of questions being asked, but nothing is clear yet. So for banks, this is challenging territory. I think number 2, this technology potentially poses a competitive threat. And again, for banks, because it's early days, to figure out what that threat is and what to do about it is a challenge. And then number 3, can banks potentially provide some sort of service to virtual currencies ultimately? And how might they monetize that and make that work? So I think, in a general sense, it's very early days for banks, and they also have quite a few other things on their plate that they're worrying about.
Well, yes, exactly, and of course that's what tends to happen, doesn't it? When something creeps up on the outside lane, if you like, and you're concentrating so hard on the matter in hand, whatever it might be, and then something like this comes, a real innovation that perhaps people didn't see coming or didn't take seriously, and particularly from the regulator's point of view. Jerry, I was struck by what you said about how banks, that these Bitcoin and other virtual currencies don't fit into existing regulatory frameworks, which of course would lead you, the obvious follow-up question is, well, change the framework, but how easy is it to do that?
Well, I think that the frameworks need to be adapted but not thrown out. And there are fundamentally, I think the right question to ask here is, well, what about the old framework doesn't work? And there are some, I think, very clear things about that. For example, there are some particular issues around storing of digital currencies. There are some particular issues around anti-money laundering, where traditional anti-money laundering systems are predicated around the fact that everyone will be going through a bank or another financial institution, and therefore the obligations are on those banks and financial institutions to do it. If there isn't a bank or financial institution on one side of the transaction, the old paradigm doesn't work. So, I mean, I think the right way to go about this, and we're seeing a lot of positive engagement from regulators around the world, is to just ask those very specific questions. What is it about this new technology that we actually can't apply the old methodologies to?
Would you agree with that?
I think so, and it's a great point that Adam makes that says, what is it about this new technology? And I think it's important that we get that clear in our heads, because something profoundly new has been invented here. Never before in history did we have the ability to transmit ownership of an asset at a distance without relying on some trusted third party, be it a bank or maybe the postman or the postwoman. And we now have that ability, thanks to Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, to transfer ownership of assets at a distance with no third parties. So it has the potential to go beyond just payments and currency. I wanted to ask you exactly that, Richard, if you wouldn't mind putting, looking into the crystal ball. Where could it all lead, if that's not an unfair question? So nobody knows for sure, but there are two areas of active research that I think are very promising. So the first is, well, what other types of assets might we want to transfer ownership of that today are difficult or expensive to transfer ownership of? So maybe securities, shares and bonds, they're quite difficult to transfer ownership today. They could be issued onto a system like Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency, and they may be easier for individuals and firms to move around. So there's a whole area of innovation there. But you can, and I know we're here at a banking conference, but you can go outside finance and say, well, actually, this system is teaching us how to build new products and services that are very decentralized, and where the dominant communication mechanism, if you like, is peer-to-peer. So just an example of what we've recently announced at IBM, we've done some research into how would the Internet of Things, so this idea that homes will be connected, your fridge will be able to order the milk for you, how is that actually going to work in the future? How are we going to manage it and make sure these things still work in 20 years' time? And the conclusions that our research team have come to is, actually, maybe this needs to be very decentralized, very peer-to-peer. Maybe some of the technologies that were invented by Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, maybe they could be applicable to securing and making the Internet of Things affordable in the future. So completely unrelated to finance, but new innovations that may otherwise have not been possible.
And still involving that element of payment. If your fridge is ordering the milk, you're going to have to pay for that milk
well,
in some
indeed.
way. So
Yes.
fascinating
Yes.
stuff. Jerry, what about banks? Can banks see opportunities to make money out of this?
Well, I think one of the really fascinating things is that we started talking about currencies, virtual currencies, and then we started talking about virtual payment systems, and now we're starting to talk about asset tracking and other things. And as has been said, I think the question is, where will it end up? And possibly banks could lend some credibility and trust to a virtual currency by getting involved. I think that's an opportunity for virtual currencies and potentially for banks down the road once the regulatory questions become a bit clearer.
And you think that clearly banks are not going to get involved until the regulation side of things is sorted out, which Adam brings me back to you. So, what is there any sign that any regulator is? We've already talked about how it doesn't fit into what's already existing, and they're going to have to change it. But who's leading the charge on this? Who do we trust on this?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of regulators are taking different approaches. There are some that are sort of taking an approach that, well, maybe it's better to let the market decide and let's warn consumers about the risks of doing this. And then you've got people like the New York Department of Services that have put out a bit license proposal about how you regulate that. And I think they deserve a lot of credit, actually, because they've just announced there'll be another round of comments, that there are some things they didn't get right, and it feels like they're engaging with this in the right way. But I mean, I think there is a real question about, well, how do we persuade the banks to get involved? If you look at the history of payments on the internet, if we go back to 1994, you could have had the same sort of reports. Well, you can't do this securely. It's everyone's getting ripped off. There's no way this is safe, and there's no market size. And really, what I think was huge in that was for all the attention that people like PayPal got, was the banks actually allowing web-based transactional services. In 1995, Wells Fargo became the first large bank to actually start offering, in a limited and controlled way, transactional services over the web. And I think it would actually be good for the development of the technology and releasing its power for good to find a way to get some banks interested in dipping a toe in the water.
Absolutely. We're down to our last few seconds, but Richard, would you agree with what Adam was just saying?
Yes, and I guess maybe my advice on my call to the regulators is, when framing these rules, bear in mind that we don't know the full potential of the technology, and the technology may not be used exclusively for financial purposes. So the risk we have to avoid, as well as the risks of the technology, are the risks that we artificially curtail it too soon in its development.
Jerry, is it time for banks to stop being fearful and embrace instead?
I think it's a time for banks to really spend time understanding how they could use the technology, and not just banks, financial market infrastructures, which is where I'm from, because there's potential there that we need to understand and potentially use for future development.
Absolutely, a call to arms there. Well, Jerry Gates, Richard Brown, Adam Shapiro, thank you very much for joining me on Sibos TV this afternoon. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you to all my guests, not just the three gentlemen to my left, who've informed, entertained and explained so much to us on Sibos TV today. I'm Daisy McAndrew. Please join me and the team again tomorrow morning, 8:30, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Enjoy the rest of your day here at Sibos 2014.